On this Wednesday evening, there is no topic in America at the moment harder to talk about than faith and politics, but there's probably no one much better than John Kyle to be prepared to talk about that topic. We're very blessed to be able to have him tonight. And he has brought two famous thespians tonight, Mary Kay and Dennis, who are actually neighbors up in Greer with the Kyles, and he's just put them on the spot. They're going to do a little skit for us at the beginning, so we're going to give you a round of applause to start, so you're not nervous. You give them a little round of applause. There we go. There we go, John. Come on.
Okay. Let's put that back for now. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me again to be talking to my friends here, and I hope that we'll have a discussion which will engender some questions on your part or some commentary. Either way, when we're all done, we can have a discussion, even a debate if you like. As Reverend Joyne said, we're going to start our discussion tonight with a hypothetical dialogue between two people who are debating. Now, just think of any subject. What's the last subject that you and your spouse were debating or you and your neighbor were debating? Let me just throw out some hypotheticals. Maybe two historians arguing about the decision to end World War II with the atomic bomb. Or two city council members debating a proposed nuisance ordinance about barking dogs. That could get pretty testy. Or your neighbor and you discussing abortion policy after the Dobbs decision, or two senators debating President Biden's student loan forgiveness policy. Just think of any subject where values are involved and you have at least two different points of view. I've asked two of our friends to come up, if you would, Dennis and Mary Kay. They're going to illustrate the dilemma that we have tonight by reading a script which I wrote, so it's not their fault here if you don't like the script, but I'll ask them to set the stage for our conversation tonight with this little bit of drama.
I think my position is logical and it expresses who we are.
Well, I disagree with you. I don't think your view makes much sense. Besides, it's contrary to my religious beliefs.
You can't bring religion into this. I don't like people forcing religion on me. Besides, remember, we have to separate church and state.
I don't care whether you accept my faith, but I do think it teaches some time-honored truths that apply to this question.
Well, thank you. And we'll accept the round of applause that occurred earlier. So you get the idea. Who's right? Should religious views be a part of our discussion of public issues? Or conversely, should they be excluded? For those of us who consider ourselves persons of faith, the question may seem strange. But to many, the opposite is true. Views even partially predicated on faith are seen as out of bounds in any setting outside the church or home. This contention was described by theologian Richard John Neuhaus in his 1984 book, The Naked Public Square. Here's what he said. What is new is the naked public square. The naked public square is the result of political doctrine and practice that would exclude religion and religiously grounded values from the conduct of public business. The doctrine is that America is a secular society. It finds dogmatic expression in the ideology of secularism. Well, in a pluralistic society and democratic republic like ours, based on a written constitution, which position is correct? Let's start with the contention that religious-based policies and discussions are impermissible in the so-called public square. There seems to be four bases for the argument. The first is religious arguments are not rational or scientific or neutral. Secondly, that employing such arguments forces religion on others. And a corollary to that is, and it makes others feel uncomfortable. And finally, arguments based on religious ideas violate a wall of separation between church and state, impermissibly mixing religion and politics. So let's start with the first argument based that says arguments based on religion are not rational or scientific or neutral. I just think, first of all, this is not necessarily true. Much in religion is rational and historic. Faith-based arguments don't have to be based on miracles or elements of religion that can only be taken on faith, like the resurrection, although leave aside the biblical evidence of Jesus' resurrection. But let's take some examples, and I'm going to focus on examples that have to do with human rights, individual rights, group rights, because they comprise so much of the foundation for debate in our society today. So let's just take that general subject of human rights. And I think I'll start with the proposition that I suspect almost everybody, whether they're secular, religious, or neither, believes in human rights, believes people should have rights. Well, where do those rights come from? Christianity and Judaism posit the origin of human rights in man's humanity, derived from our being creatures of God's creation, made in His image. That's our view. Now, there's a secular view that, and it would be called a rational counterpart, based on natural law, promulgated by English philosopher John Locke and others, that assumes something very special, something natural in mankind, warranting special treatment, in other words, human rights. Either way, whether they're based on our religious ideas or this natural rights theory, you have a belief in human rights. And I say either way, I don't think the proposition is provable scientifically. I don't know of any scientific evidence that supports either the secular position for human rights protection or those based on Christ's teaching. To me, both are rational. Let's take some other examples. Is it rational to love our mother and father and our neighbor, or to believe that we shouldn't steal or murder? I don't think those are irrational views, and the fact that we may base those views on our religious teaching shouldn't preclude them from being discussed in the public square. So I would first of all say that it is just not true that religious views are per se irrational and therefore disqualifying. Now, secondly, as to this argument that they are not rational or scientific or neutral, I think it depends on our understanding of world views. You know what a world view is? It's your philosophy of life. It's how you think about things. It's how you think about both your everyday life and the larger questions that human beings ponder. And we all have a slightly different worldview, I suspect. For those of us who are or consider ourselves religious, we know that our views are significantly influenced by our faith. Secularism is another worldview, and taken in its most specific and scientific explanation, it is a view that holds that everything has a scientific explanation, and reality is strictly a configuration of energy and matter that were originally randomly created. Now, there are some people that say, well, that's not really a worldview, but rather a set of neutral principles that don't compete with other worldviews, but rather represent a neutral ground on which the debate should take place. To me, that's nonsense. However you view all of these things, whether you are talking about reality, whether you're talking about norms of behavior, attributes of mankind, the way you look at it is your worldview. That's the way you think of things. And it therefore seems to me that the two very general points of view on worldview are one based on some kind of religion and those that are not based on some kind of religion. One of the elements of the secular point of view is that because it's scientific, everything is provable. This is the Achilles heel of secularism, because their thoughts on these subjects are no more provable than ours based upon the Bible And I'll have more to say on that in a moment. Take this matter of human rights, for example. I think almost everybody believes that there is something about human beings that entitle us to have certain rights. Well, the Christian and Judaic view is that something special is grounded in the way we were created. It's grounded in our faith. The secularists say no. They just say, well, we intuit it, it seems right, but there's no more proof for it. And I would argue that at least Christianity has a coherent and I believe perfectly rational explanation for inherent dignity. So whether you believe it or not, is the Christian view so outlandish, so irrational compared to other worldviews that it must be banned from public debate? It doesn't seem so to me. Now, to have a place in public discourse, I agree that ideas of a worldview are most persuasive if they are rational. That doesn't mean provable, as with a mathematic proof, but it does mean logical and sensible, capable of sustaining an analytical proposition. I'm not saying that in making these arguments we should shy away from arguments that are based on pure articles of faith, things that we take on faith and that clearly are not provable. I'm simply saying that to be most persuasive in the public discourse, if an idea is rational, and I believe many religious ideas are rational, they can be very persuasive. Here's an example. The Christian says, well, if you believe in God as I do, it makes sense that God intended all men should be treated with a certain dignity and favor. I believe it both because my faith teaches it and also because it seems rational to treat each other with dignity. The secularist may say, well, I agree, it seems rational to treat each other with dignity, and therefore I support human rights, but not because God said so. And I think the Christian can reply, I'm not asking you to believe that God imbued us with special dignity, only that I believe it, and my belief is rational, and thus a valid reason for me to argue that we should support human rights. Now, I'll deviate here and say, as a matter of fact, I think secularists have a very hard time finding a basis for belief in human rights because their worldview has no concept for objective morality, which is, of course, the basis of our faith. If life, indeed the cosmos, is nothing more than random energy and matter reacting with each other, if there's no overall moral purpose to the universe, it's hard to avoid defaulting to relativism as the only moral compass. And that would obviate any notion of universal human rights. Which is why I believe that the religious worldview provides a more coherent justification for basic human rights, because we are the sacred creation of God and not just an accident, as secularists argue. Let me delve into this just a little bit with some examples in real life here that once again talk about the subject of rights, human rights, individual rights, group rights. Here are two different points of view, both of which assert human rights. Martin Luther King used biblical arguments in his civil rights messages in the 1960s. In his American Dream speech, he based his claim to justice and equality on the Founding Fathers' beliefs rooted in the Bible's message of the inherent dignity and worth of man as God's sacred creation. It's exactly what he wrote. Tim Keller, in his book Generous Justice, makes the case that secularists, on the other hand, have no basis to support their positions on justice and equality. In fact, he argues this about both religious and secular views of human rights. He says, our ideas of justice are rooted in views of life that are non-provable faith assumptions. He says that about both. And yet the rules that forbid reference to religious-based arguments mean we can't justify equality and justice positions on what we know is in the Bible. So what is missing from public discourse is the why we think something is right and just. Keller continues, justice is not only about the right way to distribute things, it is also about the right way to value things. and valuing things is always based on beliefs about the purposes of life, human nature, right and wrong, all of which are moral and religious. In contrast, he says, the secularist's scientific worldview provides no help in answering the questions of why. He goes on to talk about some famous atheists. You may know these names. We heard from Stephen Hawking, Steven Pinker, and John Gray that there is no neutral scientific basis for proving that every human being, regardless of gender, race, age, and ability, has inherent worth. Therefore, even atheist and agnostic philosophers acknowledge that the concept of human rights requires a religious dimension. There's a Marxist literary critic, his name is Terry Eagleton, and he wrote that it makes an enormous difference to how one lives in the world if you see human beings as accidental beings rather than a sacred creation and gift of God. Indeed. So the first argument for keeping views with religious basis out of public discourse because they're not rational, I think fails because one, it's not true. At least it's not necessarily true. Secondly, religious views can be just as rational as views based on other worldviews, and as I've just tried to point out here, opinions based on religion actually can be more rational than justifications based on other worldviews like secularism. And this is true not just for discussions of rights, human rights, but also a lot of other subjects as well. Let's turn to the second justification for excluding faith-based arguments, that it forces religion on others. The simple answer is no, it doesn't. As long as arguments based on faith are posited as rational positions and not as arguments that depend upon acceptance of faith-based elements of religion, non-believers need not accept the basic tenets of faith in order to respect the arguments. For example, if it makes sense that we should not steal or murder or commit adultery, we can use our belief in the Ten Commandments to debate those issues rationally without insisting that our opponents must accept the story of Moses and the tablets. So we're not forcing religion on anyone. And as to the argument that it makes them uncomfortable, I'm sorry, but I don't have a lot of sympathy for this argument. Sometimes truth needs to make us uncomfortable. The key point for us is always to remember that we're trying to tailor our arguments here to persuade. And that means being sensitive to how others will take our arguments. However, I do think we should be able to assume an element of good faith and maturity in our opponents or our adversaries. Now, the final argument is that religious arguments in the public square would violate a principle that requires a wall of separation between church and state. The first thing I say about this is that removing religious-based arguments from the public square is really a question, it's a moral question, not a legal one. The question is, should we, not may we. However, since this is posited as a serious objection, and it is an urban myth, probably taught in most schools, we should discuss it. And I'm happy to do so because it's wrong. The history of our founding and the Constitution demonstrates that there never was and is not now any legal prohibition on discussing religion or faith-based arguments in public discourse. The early settlements in America were almost all to escape religious persecution and allow the opportunity to freely practice religion. In other words, in the beginning, America was all about religion. That was the one thing that bound everybody together. The earliest governing documents were a combination of religious principles and civic commitments to live by. Far from separating their governments from religion, as historian James Hudson writes, once in New England, the Puritans organized themselves top to bottom to create the kind of society they believed the Scriptures required. Laws were based on the Bible, and they used the full power of the state to promote the agenda of the church. Bible readings were a part of public school curricula because As one Massachusetts court decision put it, the Bible was the best book to inculcate the virtues which are the ornaments of human society and the basis upon which a republican constitution is founded. In fact, it could be said that religion was such a central component of each colony, and that most sects were so intolerant of others that many governments supported the practice of only one denomination in their colony. So while America was a place of many different sects, within each colony there was little separation of church and state. This was the state of things in the 17th century and in the first half of the 18th century in America. Now, in the latter half of the 18th century, the relationship between religion and the states began to change, with the sects becoming less dependent on government. The theory of the nurturing state came into conflict with the more evangelical church's desire to be free of state interference and influence. States had helped churches a lot up to then by granting them land, by buying Bible, having Bibles printed, paying for it, and then distributing the Bibles to the churches. They had done a lot to support the churches. Now, they had done this more or less equally for all of the churches so as to be able to avoid any claim that they were establishing a particular church. Nonetheless, they supported churches generally. Well, why would states do that? Why this doctrine of the nurturing state? And the answer is to foster the conditions of civic virtue and morality thought essential for a self-governing people. As Hudson summarized what he calls the founding generation's syllogism, it is this: virtue and morality are necessary for free republican government, self-governing people. Religion is necessary for virtue and morality. Religion is therefore necessary for republican government. It's that simple. This is part of what Reverend Joint was telling us last Sunday in his sermon. The important point here is that even as the states moved further away from active support of churches, the founders nevertheless believed that a moral and religious people were indispensable for a self-governing republic to survive, because only a virtuous citizenry could make the wise, selfless decisions good for the entire country. The founders, you'll see in their writings, very much feared anarchy. They feared factions pursuing greedy self-interests, and they feared the people's susceptibility to demagogues that would come and make very easy but dangerous promises to them. And they believed that civic virtue based on morality, based on religion, would prevent these evils. So what about the wall of separation? Well, here's the history of it. Many denominations willingly accepted state support, but the Baptists didn't. They believed that religion flourished the best when just left alone. However, they did believe in one thing that governments did. Before Jefferson, that is to say presidents, Washington and Adams, and many governors and other political people were in the habit of issuing proclamations of celebration, proclamations of remembrance, of prayer, of thanksgiving. It's how we eventually got to our Thanksgiving holiday. Jefferson decided to discontinue those proclamations in his presidency. He thought that they could be seen as leading to the establishment of religion. He didn't want to do that. But he was very sensitive to the fact that he had been criticized as not being very religious. This is because a lot of people thought he was a deist, not a Christian. And a deist is someone who basically doesn't believe in the divinity of Christ, believes that God may have created the world, but he then basically let us go to do whatever we did, that he didn't control the affairs of man at all or care about it. And Jefferson was very sensitive to the fact that a lot of people in America did not see him as a religious person. So he was touchy about this. But he also didn't like these proclamations. So he wrote a letter to the Baptist congregation in Danbury, Connecticut on January 1st, 1802, to explain why he was discontinuing these proclamations. He wanted the Baptists to know that his suspension was only intended to keep the state out of their religious affairs and to protect imposing a common or uniform religion, which he knew they would not want. But he didn't mean to suggest that government couldn't be supportive of religion generally, and certainly that ideas based on religion had no place in public discourse. That would have been a very odd idea to him. The historian Hudson explains it this way: Jefferson certainly did not mean to suggest the state could not support churches. And as if to emphasize the point, he immediately began attending Sunday services in the chambers of the U.S. House of Representatives, obviously a government building. He did that for 7 years. He also made available executive branch buildings like the Treasury Department for religious services as well. So he didn't separate the church and state. He was very happy to be seen as fostering the connection, as long as the Baptists didn't think that he was trying to impose religion on them, or a particular religion. And Hudson also gets right into the etiology of this idea of wall of separation, which is the phrase Jefferson used in his letter. But Hudson argues that the two Supreme Court cases that cited the letter were just wrong in claiming Jefferson thought government could have nothing to do with religion. And as I make the point, let alone that religious ideas were impermissible in the public square. Moreover, and I think, I don't know why the justices on the court didn't get this. Jefferson had very little to do with it. It was James Madison who authored the Bill of Rights, who wrote the First Amendment against the establishment of religion. And nobody ever said that James Madison thought there should be some kind of a wall of separation. And he's the author of the amendment that the court had to rely upon. So, in fact, let me quote one of my, it's a person that I don't frequently quote, but when it suits my purpose, I'm happy to do so. Here's what former President Barack Obama said, and I'm quoting: "Secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering the public square. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, indeed the majority of great reformers in American history were not only motivated by faith, but repeatedly used religious language to argue for their cause. So to say that men and women should not inject their personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality, much of which is grounded in Judeo-Christian tradition." So saith Barack Obama. So I think from the very beginning of our founding, all the way up to contemporary times, there's an understanding that so much of what we have done in the past, so much of the system that we have created and the tradition of our government is founded on ideas that had their origin in religion, that it would be silly to argue that religious ideas should be kept out of the public square. So as to this contention, that there's a great wall of separation, I simply say that that's wrong, and it follows that ideas flowing from that instruction from faith would naturally be a part of public debate and should not be excluded. Now, I'd like to close here with just a couple thoughts on how to make your arguments. If you're going to do this, if you're going to get involved in debates with each other, and you feel that it's important for you to demonstrate that part of the reason why you believe what you believe is because of your faith, I think it matters a little bit how you make these arguments, because not everybody will base their arguments on the same basis that you do. I don't think we should shy away from arguments based on our faith, but how we present them is important, because if the object is to persuade, then the argument must be persuasive, which at a minimum means not dogmatic, not preachy, but rational and hopefully accurate. The most persuasive arguments, I don't think, should require others to believe things that we accept strictly on faith, such as the divinity of Christ, the resurrection, and so forth. While we believe Jesus was far more than just a great teacher, we also believe he was a great teacher, and that his teachings did express fundamental truths relevant to today. Others can accept those truths without necessarily having to accept his divinity. That's my point here. By the same token, I do not believe we should ever back away from what we believe, even if it is strictly a matter of faith for us. If we're going to bring religion into the debate, we should be prepared to defend it and to be true to it, even if we do not argue that our opponent must accept the tenets of our faith as we do. Part of this is because in debate, one must always be prepared to defend your sources. Why should people believe the sources that you bring into the debate? Moreover, if your argument is not necessarily provable, but it is rational, it is probably at least as rational as a counter-secular argument. So challenge the provability of the secular argument. Chances are your opponent can't prove his point any more than you can prove yours. Prove in the sense of, here's a scientific explanation. So I think that anyone who bases their arguments on scientific provability is probably standing on a rather shaky foundation. And there's nothing wrong with pointing that out in your discussion. So I'm neither encouraging or discouraging you from relying upon your faith and making arguments in discussing issues of the day, but since so much of what we believe, those of us who are people of faith, is based on our faith, we shouldn't shy away from it. We shouldn't back away from it. And we should be able to argue, if we do, why it is perfectly appropriate for us to bring our religious-based beliefs into the conversation. Good luck. Okay, I think I did leave time for discussion and questions, so good.
Very good timing. Thank you. So I have the honor of asking the first question or so, just to get us started. I'm going to give you some options. These are all connected.
Multiple
these questions.
choice.
Yeah. How did you know God was calling you into politics? And how did your faith help you once you accepted that calling into politics? And finally, how did your involvement in politics deepen your faith? So. Those
are three really great questions because they have a meaning to me. Like a lot of people, in between the time that I went to church as a college student and met another college student, my wife to be Carol, in church, in Sunday school, and attended services religiously because her mother and father did. In between then and later in my life, like a lot of people, I got really busy making a career, and I was not as either involved in the community faith or personally instructed by it as I should be. Interestingly, my involvement in politics deepened my faith. In fact, it got me back on track. And I think the overall answer is because it was so hard, at least in the very beginning. I ran in a Republican primary, so I had no party apparatus behind me. In the beginning, it was just Carol and me. And I had never done anything that hard in my life. It was exhausting, it was demanding, and those are the kind of things that cause you to look outside yourself for some help. And there's nothing wrong with that. And indeed, one of the great things about running for office is that instead of just being in my little shell in my law office, I was now exposed to a lot of people out there, and lo and behold, I ran into a lot of people who were very religious and were very open about it, who were clearly practicing the Great Commandment, trying to bring religion to me. And I was really impressed by that. It made a difference to me. So I know how much of a difference it can make if all of us do that. So because of the difficulty of what we were doing, it not only brought Carol and me a lot closer. You know, she had her various activities. I had all my legal stuff to do. But here is something that we are doing together now. And it brought us closer together. It brought me much closer back to my faith. And you know, once you do get back to it, you begin studying and learning and talking to other people, and that snowballs. So all three of those questions are very relevant to my experience, and I'm happy to say that it had a great impact, a great positive impact on me.
One of the other evidences of the connection between faith and politics is the existence of chaplains that also work with our political figures. It goes back a long history in our republic, and I know one of those influenced both of us.
Indeed. John Lloyd Ogilvie, a great Presbyterian minister who is probably most famous when he was at Hollywood Presbyterian Church in LA, was called to become the chaplain of the U.S. Senate. And for 10 years, during the time that I was in the Senate, he was our chaplain. Like Reverend Joint, deeply knowledgeable, charismatic. And the great thing about Lloyd Ogilvie was not just his knowledge and his ability to explicate it, but he was a great preacher, but also a great minister. And I think I've told you before, I would get to work early in the morning, he did too. And I'd be walking down the hall of the Capitol getting ready to go to my office. His office was on the 3rd floor, he'd be coming the other way. And I knew that I might as well take about 10 minutes because he was going to say, "John, how are you this morning?" And I would say, "I'm fine." And he would find a way with that opening to figure out what was on my mind that day and how he could help me work through it. And he always did. And I always end up saying, "Yeah, I'm kind of worried about this or that." Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Which is what, of course, a great minister, you intuit your flock out here, what we need today, and you're really good at helping us to work through it. And that was a great thing about Lloyd Ogilvie. Not only was he a great teacher, but he was just a wonderful person to be around.
We have some microphones here for folks to ask questions. So it's wide open. I'm sure you have some questions about faith and politics.
Let me just mention, I was going to do this earlier. Part of what I talked about today is based on three books here. I have mentioned this book before. This is the book called Religion and the Founding of the American Republic by James Hudson, the librarian. He's a historian for the Library of Congress. And it's an excellent book. Most of you are familiar with Tim Keller, the great Presbyterian minister who started the church in New York City with, I think it's got 5,000 members or at least. Anyway, he wrote a book called Generous Justice, How God's Grace Makes Us Just. And it's a superb source for a subject like this. And then there's a book by a professor whose name is Brendan Sweetman called Why Politics Needs Religion, the place of religious arguments in the public square. Right on point. And this is Dallas Willard and Reverend Richard John Newhouse both recommend the book. So these are 3 books. If you'd like afterward, I can give you the specifics on how to get them. Excuse me.
Thank you for doing this tonight. I'm curious your thoughts on this because I've been thinking about this a lot for the last couple of years. I don't know if the question is anymore whether religion should be part of politics or not, because I would make the argument that everyone has religion. I would say the secular humanists, their religion is Christianity, Judeo-Christian value system that's inverted. Okay. And I also think that, and I don't find common ground there anymore. And so I think that it's not a question of necessarily compromising with them or trying to find a common ground with people who are looking through the looking glass from completely the opposite end. The other thing I think is, as people with religious faith, I think it's a massive mistake for us to even grant them the idea that they're following any kind of rational belief system, because they're not. You know, as someone with a couple young kids, I can tell you, you know how many teenage girls from men my age I know that now think they're boys? And you never would have thought of that 3 or 4 years ago. You know, we've seeded this idea that this opposing force, A, can be rationalized with, because I don't think it can anymore. But secondly, that there's any kind of moral high ground there, and that they have no religion, that they're basing on anything besides their own religion, which I would argue is completely inverted from what most of us here would probably believe and what I'd argue reality is.
Yeah, this is stated as an argument that we're in a new period as Christians that are active within the public realm, whereas there was a period when even secularists acknowledged the legitimacy of Christianity and were interested in the dialogue. We're now in a situation where many secularists just want to exclude Christians from discussion completely. It's become a completely antagonistic relationship.
Yeah, their point of view is you're not even entitled to join the discussion or the debate because necessarily your views are based upon religion, and that's impermissible. Next question.
But so is theirs.
That's what I'm saying. Well, yeah, okay.
They
now,
live their lives by a greater
Okay.
degree of faith than probably most
So,
Christians do.
yeah, right, okay. So we agree. Now, the question is, how do we put that question to practical use? Suppose you're arguing with somebody about one of the questions that we talked in the very beginning. Or suppose you're sitting on the city council and there's a question about whether somebody has the right to let their dog bark even though it bothers you. Or just pick any subject. You're going to find that in life, it's unavoidable sometimes to talk to people who have a very different worldview than yours. And so the question will be, do you just check out like they do? Oh, wait a minute, you're religious? Goodbye. That's their attitude a lot of times. But what if both of you are in a position of responsibility where you're supposed to try to get something done?
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to reach some kind of an agreement or an accommodation.
Or not. Because I would argue that we've compromised away a huge degree of our value system in this country.
But you may decide that it's just not worth it. And frankly, I will confess to you that toward the end of my time in the Senate, there were certain colleagues about whom I had that very point of view. It is just not worth it. It's not my time. We're not worth my time to get into it because they'll never be able to meet me halfway. But by the same token, there were times when I felt that it was worth my time to try to find some kind of common ground with an opponent in order to achieve something that I felt we needed to try to achieve, at least to fulfill my responsibilities as a senator. So I guess I would just urge a little caution in judging too quickly that it isn't worth it because they could never agree because they're on a different planet. Try. And you may conclude that after you've tried for a little bit, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. But especially if you're in a position of responsibility where you have an obligation to try, then you do need to give it a whirl. At least that's my opinion.
George.
This is a later question. Monday, I thought, was a great display of religion in the public square, which was the funeral of Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And the magnitude, the reverence that the event was given, the sincerity of the whole thing. What was your impressions of that, and what does it say about the English history that we continue to live?
David could probably be more, provide greater insight in this than I, but what struck me was the same thing that struck you. But there was a question mark at the end of it. There were two of the commentators were talking. They said, isn't it interesting how in this age of ours today, when everything is so crazy, you've got all of these people who are embracing what? The values of this woman. And what were the values? The values of loyalty and dignity and responsibility and service. Above all, service. And certainly faith. Did that portend to something about our society? And the other commentator said, probably not. They'll get over it after a few more days, which may be correct, but at least there was a recognition that she embodied those values. They were really worth something, and at least a lot of people, at least for a while, were brought back to them and remembered how important they were, and would that we could continue to remember it.
Yeah, there's. I would just add to that, because you gave me the opening. It's very dangerous to do that with a pastor. But, that I think that it was interesting that there were multi-faith representatives present at the services, and so that was a recognition that she made an attempt to be queen to everyone, even those who shared different kinds of beliefs. But nevertheless, the service was thoroughly Christian in orientation, reflecting the actual character of her individual beliefs. And I think what people from different perspectives came to respect was that she was trying to live out her own beliefs with a great deal of integrity. And when life and beliefs are connected, when people have positions that they then live out, that commands a certain respect, even from people who have different worldviews.
Yeah,
You know,
and
it can.
that would prompt me to say something else in response to your question. I think a lot of the secularists are fearful of people with religion. They're vacant. There's a vacuum there. They lack something. And I think sometimes they don't like the fact that they lack that. And I think if you do engage with them, even though they start out, like this, if you do engage with them in a Christian way, you might just crack through that. And you wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised that some of those people would be surprised at how you make your points, and would be kind of encouraged by the ideas that you bring forth.
And many of the secular answers to some of our most endemic problems haven't worked well and aren't working well. And so that gives an opportunity for us as Christians to step into those deep issues around us and make a difference. And that in itself is compelling. It becomes a great argument.
But if we're confident of what we believe in, we can persuade people sometimes.
Yeah.
Gary?
John, a comment and then a question. I was teaching the Truth Project. You remember that? Dale Tackett's thing from Focus on the Family. We had a video, and I spent time explaining what truth was, and I was so excited about it. I was just on fire. And the minute I got up in front of the group, this one guy in the back said, "What makes you think you have the truth?" My first reaction was anger. My second reaction was I was embarrassed. Do you know what I learned? I turned it back on him. I said, "Well, tell me what your definition of truth is." And it gave me a moment to catch my breath, to recover, not get angry with him, and lose an opportunity at that particular time. So I appreciate what you're saying. The question I have, we have a big election coming up in November. And I keep hearing that if we don't, I say we, believers, well, supposedly most of us in here, do not get this thing turned around, that the next thing that's going to happen is they're going to take our religious freedoms away.
This argument that Newhouse identified in 1984 wasn't necessarily the beginning of that proposition. I mean, it's been going on for some time, but it certainly is a manifestation of the idea that, at least in affairs of government, there are a lot of people who believe that our views have no place whatsoever. So that's part of what this is. In addition to that, I would say that up until very recently, with a change in personnel in the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court had gone way off track in balancing the two clauses of the First Amendment relating to religion, the free exercise of religion, and Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. They went way overboard in paying every bit of attention to the establishment clause, no establishment, and didn't pay any attention whatsoever to the free exercise. It got way skewed. Now, there have been a couple decisions in the last 3 or 4 years that have begun to reverse that trend, and I believe with the current membership of the court, it'll continue to move that way. So it's not all a train moving just in one direction. I think there are some back and forth ideas as we fought back. The whole idea of interpreting the Constitution from an originalist point of view, it's not a religious point of view, but if you believe James Hudson, the original idea was almost all a religious idea. So if we are turning to the originalist interpretation of what the Constitution means, we're going to find a lot of religion in there. And even though the mainline churches have lost their way in many respects, you know that that there is a real revival of the evangelical spirit in the country. So I wouldn't give up, and I think it's also a mistake to believe, by the way, and I know you're not suggesting this, neither party has a lock on faith. There are people of faith in both political parties, but it is true that there is a movement abroad in the land today, the progressive movement, which sees itself as very scientifically based, and therefore bases a lot of its positions on at least I would call it a faux scientific base. And I think the thing to do in any of those situations where you're confronting those people is just say, okay, let's talk about scientific proof. Where's your scientific proof? And the fact is, in a lot of the arguments of non-religious people that are supposedly all this basing everything on science, there's no science to it, because a lot of what we're arguing here has to do with human nature, with normative behavior, things that aren't matter and energy bumping into each other, but what's in our head and in our heart. Mike, is that it? Are we getting our mics cut off, or you have a question?
Well, I'll let you decide after I ask my question.
Okay, all right. Fair enough.
Yeah, probably last question, and then individual
Sure. I was
discussion.
going to ask, how do you, given the tenor of political discourse in our country right now, how do you expose yourself or create opportunities to encounter opinions that differ than yours now? I ask because, like in my own, for my own life, as you continue to grow and mature and raise families and stuff like that, there's a tendency, I think, right now to simply run to whichever corner sounds like what you want to believe, and then shut everyone else out. And I think that does a disservice to us. And I think, plugging this place, one of the things I value about this community is its ability to hold in tension opposing viewpoints, and be able to respect people for that. An example would be, I have an immense respect for you, yet I probably disagree with you on a great number of different policies. But that's what's great about being here in a faith community. So I guess, how do you, someone who has to hold or is representative of certain ideas based on your profession, how do you expose yourself and are able to maybe hold to what you still have, but reach out to or hear from other areas that you respect that make different?
It used to be I had to, because of my job, every day on the Senate floor. But since I've retired, I've tried to keep up with reading and, to the extent I can, commentary on television, for example, that covers both, and I say both sides of the spectrum, really, all elements of the spectrum. If you don't know what the other side is thinking, you're not going to be able to effectively deal with their points of view, even if you disagree with them. And there are a lot of times, well, for example, just today I'm reading a bunch of stuff that's pretty deep stuff about the basis for the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions, and within what I would consider to be my part of the spectrum, there's a big debate brewing. And I think I know which side of that debate, but that's just within my own sort of family, You have to learn to think critically, to make distinctions, to analyze things, and not just go along with whatever your cable TV channel says. That is crazy, because I guarantee you there is no cable TV channel that, well, I won't say anymore, but they are all turning into simply talking point mouthpieces for a particular point of view. So that's a pretty bad choice. Try to find some more honest writings that you can parse and think about, and find ways to converse with people that you don't agree with, and try it out, see what they think. That's a good way to find out what other people are thinking about. It never hurt anybody to hear the other side. You may not be able to agree with them. It may not be a productive exercise at the end, but I think for our own purposes, it's always better to at least try to understand it. Besides that, I think it's the right thing to do. I really thank all of you for being here tonight, for giving me the opportunity to present my views, and David for your support as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's thank John in prayer as we get ready to go. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of this time, for the insights that we've heard, and really for the wonderful traditions that we can claim and own and then learn how to pass on and reshape that come from our own American tradition. Help us to learn how to be faithful and engaged even with those with whom we disagree. We ask this through Christ our Lord, and all God's people said. Amen. Thanks for coming tonight.